Welcome everybody. Glad to have you. I'm Rami Khouri, Director of the ISIL Fighters Institute. We're very pleased to have with us today Ms. Sigrid Kaag. Sigrid is the Special Coordinator of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the United Nations Joint Mission, which has worked since last October to remove the declared chemical weapons materials from Syria. And this is a unique, unprecedented kind of operation. Sigrid has headed it. She has a lot of knowledge and experience in the Middle East. She was Regional Director for UNICEF. She worked with UNDP globally out of New York as Assistant Secretary General. She's had many other involvements with multilateral international organizations in the Middle East. And she has headed a team that has been charged and has successfully completed this mission. So we were very pleased when she agreed to come and give a public talk about the lessons learned from this experience. What are the insights that she can share with us about what other international, multilateral, United Nations, other operations in the Middle East perhaps can learn from this. So please join me in welcoming her, and we will have she'll talk for as much as she wants, and then we'll have an open Q&A. And this is being taped, so we'll put it on the web. So when the Q&A comes, we'll wait till you get the microphone and take it from there. Thank you, Sigrid. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Rami. Well, thanks to Rami and the ISIL Fighters Institute. I think by now we can look back actually on a long collaboration and friendship. And I'm always delighted to be here, and when Rami asks, I certainly turn up. I'm a firm believer also in the Institute and what he's put down. And thank you for your time. Ramadan Kareem to those of you who asked, of course, in this holy month. I'm very honored to speak on an experience which we're still in a way in and exiting from, transitioning. And as you know, looking back at the media, chemical weapons elimination is about to be accomplished, but a little bit more needs to be done. So my talk is not focused on mission accomplished, and I would never dare to say that when we're looking at the tragedy that has really befallen the people of Syria and the region in the years of this crisis. That's one. And secondly, the chemical weapons story, of course, is only one of the many components that are really important when you look at the political and humanitarian mosaic of Syria and the region, and Lebanon as a host country to a large number of Syrian refugees and displaced, of course, knows that intimately well. Now, chemical weapons, maybe I need some light.
Just a minute.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, I'll continue there. That's okay. Actually, when we're looking at some of the questions, indeed, that Rami posed, it's, okay, what have we done? I'll speak a little bit on how it was done, what made it unique, and maybe what could be elements for success if you were to think of replication. But I'll also try to point to, perhaps, the limitations that make it very specific to this experience, and why maybe in another setting or on another broader issue it may be harder. But it's to challenge us. It's to challenge, I think, how multilateralism works and can work even better. It's also to challenge us in our thinking when we put labels of, of cynicism or, oh, it can't be done. And I think that was really the heading when we started out early on in the month as the heading of a New York Times article. They said it couldn't be done. I almost missed it. One of my colleagues here, Toby Harvard, came back to it this morning. And it's true, we said to each other, it is true. Actually, the skepticism of the international community and the low level of expectations around the ability and feasibility of the elimination of Syria's chemical weapons program, the level of cynicism was very high. And the expectations were very low, but the pressures were equally high. So I'll try to speak a little bit on the initial reflections. Now, of course, going back to Syria about a year ago, we're looking at Syria then in the context of non-proliferation, in this case chemical weapons, but also the risks and threats and assumed, not yet declared chemical weapons posed to the region and the country, also when you look at a very volatile security situation in country. With chemical weapons, you have a number of risks. A, there is the Chemical Weapons Convention, Secondly, you also want to make sure that state parties are accountable. And secondly, the weapons should never fall in the wrong hands. And with the fluidity of the security setting in the region, I think that is increasingly of concern. After the terrible attack that happened in Ghouta, of course, which shocked the world, and I think the images will be with us always, and the demands for action were very clear. You will recall, particularly being in Lebanon, the discussions around the military strike, the preparations potentially for evacuation, also when it comes to some staff here maybe. But it was averted at the time by the now famous Russian-American Framework Agreement. It really laid down the parameters for Syria's accession to the Chemical Weapons Convention, and it put down the ask for a very clear plan. And I ask you to remember a clear plan of action was critical to the success. Because the plan of action demands transparency, it sets timelines, it asks for implementation, and it holds everybody that is party to this, not just the state party, accountable. Basically, what have you done to enable success, and what hasn't happened if delays or obstacles to implementations occur. This plan, basically the ask of elimination of Syria's chemical weapons program, as you know, was confirmed by the OPCW, the organization of the lead agency, in a way, for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, by their Executive Council, and I would say above all also the Security Council, and under Chapter 7 of the Charter. That's extremely important because this program was the only component of the Syria dimension, the Syria context, that is actually fallen under Chapter 7. It's extremely important. So it positioned, in a way, a non-proliferation agenda item at the political peace and security decision-making body of the UN, the highest organ, and at the same time it was a technical assessment that was going to be reviewed, monitored, debated to the level of the minutiae of details you could never imagine a number of member states of the Security Council debating, but this is the level of importance every member state accorded to the sound and timely elimination of Syria's chemical weapons. That is discussed every month by the Security Council. Now the what? What have we done? It was the elimination of chemical weapons, as we know, based on Syria's initial declaration. Now, a declaration, and I am not, as you may recall from a number of media articles, I've always been very clear, I was not chosen by any straw of the imagination because of any knowledge of chemical weapons or chemical weapons elimination. I was asked for different reasons. I hope that obviously I met the expectations, but what's important to know when a state party accedes to the Chemical Weapons Convention, it does so on the basis of an initial declaration. It is always the state party that draws this up. Syria did it under extreme timelines, I think within the course of 2 weeks. A wide range of member states do this over a protracted period, but of course it had to happen for all the reasons that we know why. It was politically guided, it was also operationally monitored, and the role of the Russian Federation, the US, was instrumental throughout. We started with the framework agreement, endorsed by the Executive Council of OPCW and Security Council, but the political stewardship, the sponsorship, and the coaching, the reviewing, and the diplomacy exercised by both the Russian Federation and the US in a tripartite relationship with the joint mission, with myself, has been instrumental to see success. And it's also why the Secretary General most recently, I believe upon the appointment of Staffan de Mistura as Special Envoy, reminded the international community that when there is political will, a lot can happen even when expectations are low. It's the political will and the duration of the commitment that has been extremely important. Now, what have we done? We started with a work plan, and I certainly will not delve into the details because it's neither interesting, but it's a fairly technical program of work. On the one hand, we functionally destroyed and verified and supervised the functional destruction of all of Syria's chemical weapons program. You have to imagine mobile labs, you have to imagine mixing and filling equipment, you have to imagine tactical warheads, you have to think of tunnels, you have to think of chemical weapons material. Now the chemical weapons material is exemplified, for instance, by mustard gas. Some of you may recall the day mustard gas left the country was only a small percentage of Syria's declared chemical weapons arsenal, but it was very, very important due to the ability to do serious harm when mustard gas is unleashed on a civilian population, or of course, or an adversary. So these are examples of what makes a chemical weapons program. We've looked at functional destruction, verified, inspected, And a big part of our time was spent on implementing something new, which is destruction of chemical weapons material out of Syria. Because Syria was at war, most of the sites were hard to access or not safe to continuously access. It was impossible to conceive of destruction in country because of the time involved, the security risks to ourselves, but the broader security setting. So member states, led by the US, looked for alternatives. You may recall that a number of countries were approached. Albania at one stage was approached also to see if it was willing to take the chemical weapons material, destroy it in country. A number of other countries were asked. None of the political or environmental parameters proved sound that a government was willing to undertake this. So the US came up with a new technology, tested before but never tested at sea, which is basically destruction of chemical weapons material by means of hydrolysis, dilution in essence. But for this we had to mount a huge maritime endeavor. Again, it's a new thing for the UN. I know those from the colleagues familiar with UNIFIL know about the UNIFIL boats, but in general the UN doesn't really operate maritime capacity, and we don't engage in out-of-country destruction, not just for chemical weapons material, but we had to mount an alliance of countries, Russian Federation, the US, UK, Norway, Denmark, and China, to secure Syrian waters when chemical weapons material left Latakia, when they were finally extracted, to keep it on Norwegian and Danish vessels until the US came with its ship, which was specifically fitted for purpose of chemical weapons material. I'm giving you this as an example because as we went through this exercise of implementation, we were having to always introduce new elements because everything was unprecedented in this operation. A country accedes to a convention at a time of war, it implements at a time of war. You have a unique political partnership between the Russian Federation and the US, supported by many other actors, Security Council Chapter 7, and at the same time logistics, operations, supervision and monitoring has to happen. So I think it's an example of how a technical mission in a heavily politicized environment actually has to demonstrate a lot of acumen, but also has to get the job done somehow, because I've often been quoted, or rather I think I said it too often myself, the clock is ticking. For us in this mission, we were acutely aware that the ultimate deadline to achieve completion of destruction of Syria's chemical weapons program was 30th of June. A lot of intermediate milestones were set by the Executive Council of OPCW and discussed by the Security Council, but what really mattered at the end of the day is that the 30th of June deadline was met. So it took a lot of effort, a lot of work. So it was a complex process of planning, coordination and staffing, and a marriage of two agencies, OPCW, which is a very technical agency, which certainly had never operated under conditions of war, because state parties do not exceed normally under these times. And secondly, with the UN, which was the political and operational arm. So we gelled two organizations with complementary mandates, but under one big overarching mandate to deliver as the joint mission on this role. And that, of course, put us in the limelight of media attention. It became, potentially could have become a political lightning rod if, I think, with the support of member states, we had not been able to manage the politics of staying out of politics and keeping our eye on the ball despite all the pressures. Because you will recall from the beginning of this mission, not everybody was happy about the agreement. A lot of the Syrian opposition representatives were doubtful. There were countries of the region who were skeptical. So there was a lot of awareness raising, there was getting to the job in order to build trust and credibility, and at the end of the day, this is a very measurable mission. I mean, you can count it, you can have to see it, you have to demonstrate and verify and prove that things have been destroyed. This is not a process of dialogue where you can go back and say we've had a very good meeting, the parties feel more comfortable. No, it is very finite, it's very specific. There's a lot of politics around that, a lot of negotiations, and a lot of implementation challenges, but the ultimate outcome can be seen, basically. And I think that is something we have to go back on. What was unique, I would say, make 4 observations here. We've implemented on an evolutionary approach. I think by now you will have understood that we started something. We knew the end game, we knew what had to be done, but how, with whom, and when was something we had to construct together. We've benefited from the constructive cooperation of the Syrian authorities from the beginning of this mission till now. That is something we've always reported on and reflected, and it's the state party accountability, but it is the Syrian political will to implement this program that is clearly a factor in successful implementation. Coupled with strong political support, I would say constructive pressure by, for instance, the government of Iran and the Russian Federation, tremendous support also by the United States, of course, and a group of 30+ countries. Third item is unity of purpose and consensus all the time by the Security Council, which you don't, of course, you see it in other agenda items. The Council is not always as united on many other issues. On this particular issue, coming out of the Syria file, the Council was acutely aware it needed to maintain its unity of purpose and voice. And each month when I go back to brief the Council, I was often asked also in more challenging times when it didn't necessarily look as if success was around the corner, the Council would ask, what do you need, Special Coordinator? What does the joint mission need? And one of our basic asks was always, please retain that unity of purpose and voice. Because that's important for us. It provides us backing, it gives us leverage, it also allows us to speak to the Council, with the authorities, with other partners, on the issues in hand, and get the job done. We were never short, and I know Rami knows this also from other lives, we were never short of funding and technical support. And that, I come out of the humanitarian development world as well, and I look at my colleague Anne Dismore of UNRWA. There are many agencies, funds and programs also in this region to get the support, the tangible support, funding or technical or staffing you need to do the job is often quite lacking. There's always a competition of over-resources. There's a diversion of resources. There are priorities that are set by others that don't necessarily gel with the priorities that are clear in front of us. With our mission, that was unequivocal, and I know we've always been extremely privileged. I sometimes found it almost embarrassing when you look at the acute and dire humanitarian conditions in country or in the region of refugees, displaced, and others when protection issues are so critical to the fore. We have not had that, but we have to call it a very clear parameter for success if ever we want to replicate it. It has to be upfront, it has to be available, it can't come 6 months later, it has to be now. And in our case, that was very, very clear, it was all there. We've also benefited immensely from the facilitation and the quiet diplomatic support, for instance, of the government of Cyprus, which offered us a staging ground so we could always work in a safe and secure environment, where not everybody was looking at what we were doing, and certainly for Cyprus there was no immediate connectivity to the Syria file in this way, so we had a quiet working space in addition to our headquarters in Damascus. The role that the government of Lebanon has played to allow us to just come in and out, experts, equipment, sourcing staff, etc., borrowing staff from UNIFIL, borrowing staff from UNSO, has been phenomenal. And again, if you don't have that, if every border crossing is an obstacle, it changes the dynamics of a very finite planning and operational activity. Now, multilateralism, what has this exercise meant? I mean, I won't go back now to the 30th of June, I think you've read the media. The last consignment actually of Syria's chemical weapons material has left the country on the 23rd of June. We didn't celebrate success because we don't think it's appropriate. What we did is mark the occasion that a new chapter begins in the life cycle of the elimination of Syria's chemical weapons program, and we're now working to complete residual activities. One of them is to confirm that Syria's initial declaration on its chemical weapons program is as complete as can be, and secondly, to ensure the destruction of a number of production facilities. But I have to demystify that, it sounds grand, they are tunnels and hangars. So it's quite specific. It's not a huge factory, there's no mystification around it. But coming back what it meant for multilateralism, I think multilateral diplomacy, which we've engaged in, between OPCW, UN, but as a joint mission, with very focused and clear delivery, as I mentioned, and the ability to assist. So again, you have to be able to walk the talk, and I think that was very clear in the case of our mission too. We could give advice, we monitored, we verified, we spoke to the Council, but our voice also carried in country because we were part of the solution, we were part of implementation. And I think that sometimes, as we know, there can be a relative weakness to advocacy if advocacy is not coupled with practical ways forward and concrete assistance, after a while your audience may say, well, that's very fine and nice, but what are you going to do with me or for me? So it was multilateral diplomacy with a very practical mandate and the ability to help deliver. I think a big lesson or a big takeaway for us was the ability to take risks. On the one hand, it's of course caution around personal risks, safety and security of our own staff and personnel, never putting staff in unnecessary harm or in harm's way in a very volatile security situation, but the political risks around solutions, around stating, for instance, that we think progress is still achievable. You may recall that from our side we've gone almost to a fair extent to reassure member states that we thought the deadline was still achievable, even though by that time a number of member states said, well, we can't see how. We kept saying, if we look at the evidence, the facts on the ground, if the Syrian authorities do this and this by these days, yes, the deadline will be met. If they don't do A, B, C by this date, the deadline will not be met. So we've always kept it also very factual. We were transparent, very facts-based, evidence-based, and basically sort of sustained, I think, in that sense, a calm. But the reputational risk was very much for the UN hat, because we go to Security Council. The reputational risk was always ours as well. And we've embraced it, partly because it was the right thing to do, and secondly, because we felt it was also our credibility. We're here to deliver. We will call a spade, but before we get to that point, we believe that a lot of solutions lie in the quiet diplomacy, in leveraging our strong partners in this endeavor, the US, the Russian Federation, to work consistently with the authorities also, particularly when there are problems, and to raise an early polite alarm when things are going off track. That gives you the ability to be part of the solution and to state very clearly, multilateral system, this is where we're at, we propose this, are you supporting it or not? So I think it's an evolutionary game, it's not very stagnant, and given that we only had 9 months to achieve it, I think every day presented either a new problem, but also an opportunity. Another lesson I would say learned, and we're talking about inclusive multilateralism, is the system, the UN system in particular, made, as I mentioned, all its staff and assets available. If we had to start this operation without having been able to draw on UNIFIL, UNSO, the tremendous political support and weight of the Secretary General and his team and member states, we may still be talking about an implementation plan. So what it shows is the UN system can be very agile, very responsive, and I think we all know this from crisis situations in the region. We do a lot and beyond the call of duty, but the support has to be there. I mean, one hand can't clap. Multilateralism at the end of the day is all of us, is member states, but it's also individuals, and I think there's obviously an element of courage. But the priority of this mission's success, I think, was a key enabler. There are many other missions, maybe that have been around also for a very long time, that they risk being forgotten, or they become sort of part of an agenda, yes, important, but the member states or partners are not focused with the same sense of urgency and alacrity. We benefited from that, but it's a fine line, because you can also fall off the cliff very quickly because of the pressures. And I think the ability for the system to withstand and manage the pressures has equally been very important. Last but not least, use of technology, one way or another, not just for the destruction of the chemical weapons material, but also for reporting, for surveillance, for verification and monitoring. When we couldn't do things the traditional way, send out teams to inspect and verify, we use technology. There are protocols for that, and there are efficiency gains in that. There's a reduction of safety and security concerns, and I think there's also the evidence base that you build that sort of reinforces the political trust member states need to have that indeed the chemical weapons as declared are destroyed, and here it is, here's a film, here's a GPS tracker, here is my footage, and we rely in this day and age so much more, and social media is one form of it, of course, on the evidence in front of us that we can share with a wider audience. It's a huge confidence building measure, and it's a tremendous efficiency gain for the multilateral system. We do not have to turn up with huge numbers of staff. Just by way of example, our entire team between New York, The Hague, if you look at the joint mission, Cyprus and Damascus, was 120 people. Now partly this is so because the Syrians were accountable and responsible for the bulk of physical implementation. but to do the reporting, the coordination, logistics, equipment, management, the politics, the travel, managing across different continents, and get a job done in 9 months means that you have to be very lean, and I suppose politically a little bit mean, but really focused on achievement. And you can do it with small teams. Again, it's efficiency gains, it's use of technology, it is information sharing. Now, last but not least, I think we worked a lot with countries from the region who were in close contact with parties to the conflict in Syria. And they have been sort of maybe the understated partner in the room, but we've often called on them to leverage their influence to make sure that implementation could happen in a safe and secure manner. That's one. Shuttle diplomacy, the traditional form, still played a huge role. I'm a firm fan of VTC and phone calls and Skype, but not every counterpart is so keen to use that yet. So when we met people, we tried to just stay in touch all the time. So when you talk about coordination, it's actually working your political network to make sure everybody is still geared around the same agenda. But also managing expectations and perceptions. As I mentioned from the outset, expectations were very low, not ours. I mean, we had no choice. We had to have high expectations. And that helps. I think there's nothing but a timeline to focus attention, and there's nothing like a measurable mandate to focus everybody else's attention. And that may be some of the lessons learned. Now, is replication possible, either in this region? It'd be interesting to debate with you what you think. On the one hand, I think we have to remember timeline was important, unity of purpose, a technical mandate, but with political, the heaviest and highest level political backing, the necessity also for the authorities to get this job done as they signed up as a state party, and the tremendous time pressures because of the changing configuration of the conflict in Syria and the region. And I think there's a shared concern that chemical weapons materials should never chemical weapons should never be used again, and it should certainly also not fall in the wrong hands. Now, there are elements for success, I think, in replication. The last part, of course, is that we see more and more in multilateralism, I think, that you've got the traditional friends and allies, alliances, that has shifted a lot, and I'll look to Rami and his colleagues for their comments. On certain themes and issues, you'll find that country A needs to work with country B, but they're not in a traditional political alliance, let alone a friendship. But they are the critical ingredients to achieve progress, and we see that a lot, I think, in the Middle East in particular. You see that more and more. So do we need to break away and rethink? The humanitarian development community has done so for a long time. You see a lot of alliances that say girls in school. You have an alliance on global health beyond the MDGs. You've got alliance for maternal mortality. You've got big networks, foundation-led, NGO-led. You've got thematic or issue-based alliances and collaborative efforts. And this is much more the way of the modern world, because it brings in NGOs, it brings in think tanks, it brings in foundations, and it brings in member states. It can be an efficient and a very effective way of working. Whether this is a way forward for the more complex political solutions, where of course state parties are still first and foremost, and a range of non-state actors are party to an agreement and solution, but I think it's a way to think and to look at how purposeful, specific, measurable partnerships can be constructed. Because at the end of the day, we need that, now more than ever before, if we look at the crisis around us. And leadership. But leadership is not necessarily an individual, it is ownership of a problem and ownership of a solution. And leadership is not ownership, but it can be a shared endeavor. And I fundamentally believe that, and I think this is something very much where multilateralism, we have to take it back to shared ownership of a problem, the responsibility when we look at human rights, international humanitarian law, but then also really walking the talk to address these types of issues. So we've been finite, time-bound, very specific, measurable, but this UN system certainly believes there may be some lessons we can take away from this experience and hold ourselves in front of a mirror and see if we can do better and under which conditions. But I think we have to be very clear what these conditions are. Not say yes before the clarity of purpose and the expectations of all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sigrid. Let me ask the first question, if I could. Is there a process within the United Nations system to capture these lessons, and have you had the opportunity to engage with colleagues all across the UN system, whether on a personal basis or on a political professional basis, to spark a wider appreciation of these lessons?
No, thank you very much. It's something that is very close to both our hearts, one way or another. I believe in constant rejuvenation and reform, partly by doing, but also this reflective process. There is a standard process whereby when a mission wraps up, and actually you triggered my thought, we are one of the first, in this case joint mission, but let's also speak to the UN in particular, where we've searched, but we're also about to conclude. And that is quite unique, and that in and of itself calls on a reflection to say, what will it take? Because as you know, there are a number of missions that, because of the complexity of the situation or the lack of solution, they stay for a very long time. But continuation of presence does not always actually lead to a reinforcement of trust or credibility, but the necessity, of course, of the job to continue. In our case, because we can conclude over time, we can transition out and hand over what we call residual work. There is a lesson for that. So we are engaging internally in a lessons learned exercise, but as I just mentioned to Rami, I would very much benefit from universities or think tanks, or let's say the ISIL Fighters Institute, to help us think through what is a case study. Because I think when academics and think tanks engage, it's a different way of constructing lessons learned from a public policy advice than when the practitioners ourselves conclude them. We may sometimes get stuck a little bit more in the nitty-gritty, and what our own lessons learned exercise is trying to do to not get stuck there, because otherwise we might say, well, you know, financial rule A, maybe we can change that. There are a lot of internal management and administrative enablers that can be changed, and rules and regulations that need to be loosened up. But the kind of public policy advice is something I think we need to draw much more on universities, and we will, for our mission, certainly seek to do that in the coming months. So indeed, that a lot of the curiosity that our mission has triggered in the system and externally, we can respond properly, but also with the distance we need to have. Currently, we're still a little bit too much in it, so maybe we're a little bit in the weeds because we're about to wrap up. I think the distance is needed to sort of go above and have that view from the bridge. You can say, what are the key parameters, and that has to be a given for success.
Thank you. Well, we've already discussed about the ISIL Fighters Institute working to do a case study now, which we're very excited about. And there's a situation in Gaza right now where UNRWA has drawn on the help of many UN agencies, and with an emergency shipment a few days ago, I think with United Arab Emirates and Dubai support and others. Many UN agencies are now helping UNRWA with food, with medicine, with child support, children's issues. So again, there's a study to be done in Gaza, which we're going to initiate next month, to understand what are the implications for the UN system and how can it operate best in cases of emergencies or political urgency, as you did in Syria. So we'll open it up for questions and comments from the audience. Who would be the first to start? There's one back there. Wait for the mic and identify yourself.
Hi, Kevin Cooper. So do you anticipate any action regarding dual-use chemicals like chlorine?
No, it's a good question. It's not yet addressed. As you know, and it's not in the remit of my mission, chlorine, of course, is not forbidden, but the use of chlorine as a weapon of war is forbidden under the convention. A fact-finding mission was launched by OPCW from The Hague. It produced an initial report. However, it is continuing to conduct interviews. It wants to talk to those who have either been eyewitnesses and collect other information. It is ongoing. It's a very difficult discussion because chlorine itself is never going to be forbidden. It's the use. So the fact-finding mission needs to continue its work, and then the Security Council, I know, will want to discuss the findings, but the complete report is not ready yet.
Thank you for that very informative talk about the whole process. And one of the things that caught my eye is the fact that Security Council had consensus. There was political cover for this mission, which never happens usually around many, many issues that go to the UN. So I see, other than the fact that your leadership has been so effective and your planning and execution has been probably one of the biggest parts of the success, the other part, as you pointed out, was the fact that the Security Council had given political cover and there was consensus to move this along. And politically, that rarely happens. How do we change that? I think is really important if we're going to try to adapt, what happened here to other problems around the world.
No, you're absolutely right, and at times also I think for us it's been a blessing, and we've always been very careful to nurture it and cultivate it. At the same time, we're always acutely aware as well that on another topic around the Middle East, or another item, let's say on the Syria file, the Security Council could not agree neither to a presidential statement or action or other items. So it requires a lot of effort, but of course the political choices by member states are the ones at the end of the day that drive this. Hence I think it's very important, and I hope that I certainly keep doing that we manage expectations, that indeed nowadays I read a lot in media that, can the chemical weapons experience be modeled on situation A, B and C, and then I'm the first one who will want to say, well, let's hang on a minute, what are the conditions and what are the commitments member states are prepared to make? If that is the case, then you can work it through. But the political preconditions and parameters, I think, need to be there. That's why I also referenced a number of times the Russian-American Framework Agreement, because even at the peak or the evolution of the dimensions of the Ukrainian crisis in all its facets, the agreement and the tripartite talks we had with the US and the Russian Federation never faltered. And it was always clear, and everybody made an effort to insulate the discussions around this file from all other geopolitical tensions that may exist. And I think that has been quite unique as well. So sadly, for now, we have been the only relatively good news coming out of Syria. And of course, from a humanitarian or political perspective, that is just not good enough. And the Secretary General has been very clear about that, as are the different member states. But then you ask yourself the question, what will it take to get to that point? I mean, I think replication or taking elements of what is a successful formula, it comes back to the political 101, political consensus, or at least strong political commitments to see this through together and negotiate on the parameters potentially. But the starting points have to be fairly clear. And you can't define the starting point at the end.
Thank you very much for that. Actually, I'm curious to ask about during your mission inside Syria, if you have such a kind of contact or connections with non-governmental parties when looking for that, comparing with other UN agencies that just recently they were allowed to go inside Syria, the humanitarian aid to go inside Syria without the permission of the regime of the government. So, such a kind of complex situation, what kind of access or what kind of connection with non-governmental parties? Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, our context for the purpose of this mission with, in this case, non-state actors, or let's say armed opposition groups, has been very limited. And it's been primarily through the office at the time of Mr. Brahimi, looking at sort of very local situations, making sure that if convoys were to happen or our team went out to verify and inspect, that they would not be inadvertently caught in crossfire, or that we would have a safe situation to address. The chemical weapons program was very firmly under the control of Syria as a state party. So our contacts have always been with the government. When it came to asking member states of the region to exercise their influence over parties or actors to the conflict in Syria, we spoke with Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, had a very productive mission to Iran very recently as well. So this is how we worked to other contacts, but at a local level, primarily through our liaison officers or security officers, we engaged with a number of other representatives. But chemical weapons program are generally a government program.
Hi, I'm an intern here at ISIL Fighters. I have a question. I don't know to what extent you can answer me, but we all know that the idea of having a mission for the prohibition of chemical weapons in Syria came after there were accusations for the Syrian regime of using them. But actually the regime never admitted that it did really use them, especially in the areas of Ghouta and so on. I find there's something missing here where the regime was accused of using them, it does not admit that it used them, and then you are saying that they completely cooperated with you with regards to the mission and whatsoever. I don't know if you understand what I mean, but I think there's something missing in here. Do you have any comment on that? And another thing, do you think it is the solution whenever a country uses chemical weapons to simply go and to just take away their weapons, the chemical weapons, and just leave it like that, free? That's a question actually to the UN Security Council. Thank you.
Well, I think I'll relay your question to the Council, but I think what you're really asking is twofold. What has been the outcome of the Selstrom report, which investigated the accusation of usage of chemical weapons? And I think that report did not provide conclusive results in terms of the different directions. Our mission was not mandated to inspect. We were not an investigation mission, we were an implementation mission. Hence we have focused, and it's very important, particularly in these circumstances when there are many other issues around you, that you focus actually on your mandate. That's why I mentioned before, we were working in a heavily politicized environment with different perspectives, expectations, and policy views. But the ask of elimination was clear. It was a difficult decision. It was decided between the Russian Federation and the US, and you know it was considered to have averted military strikes. And from that, everybody moved on, did not forget neither about the victims or the issues of accountability. And of course, there are many references to the accountability when it comes to human rights violations, also in this regard. But this mission had to happen in this way. Now, if and how the Security Council looks at this, I think you have to follow the statements. And a number of countries, of course, have tried to link this back to the ICC, and I think that's where your question lies.
Can I ask you another question? You said this was the only action in the Middle East that was based on Chapter 7?
For Syria.
In Syria?
For Syria, this is the only one.
What's your analysis of the implications of that? If this had not been under Chapter 7, do you think things would have happened differently?
It's hard to speculate the benefit of hindsight. I think the fact that 2118 falls under Chapter 7 is significant. But of course you need to have the political will of the Council to, if a situation were to arise, hasn't, where non-compliance is considered, then Chapter 7 becomes important. But this is now all in the realm of speculation and not very helpful, considering we're about to move on in this case from some chemical weapons elimination. But it's been significant because other parts, of course, were not allowed or committed under Chapter 7, under that peace and security umbrella.
And another question, if I could. You worked, the Council and your team worked on the basis of the declaration from the Syrian government. Are you convinced that the declaration was complete? And do you have any evidence that there may be chemical weapons in the hands of other people in Syria besides the government?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a question that is often raised, and my answer is always as follows: that it's a process. One of them is that a state party submits a declaration. It's done in haste. Revisions have already occurred in collaboration with the Joint Mission as we were working in country. And currently there are a number of what we call declaration assessment missions of experts only on the Syrian declaration that come to Damascus from time to time under the umbrella of the Joint Mission to discuss, to negotiate, to review and compare notes with the Syrian authorities. Member states, however, a number, have made it clear throughout the media and other channels repeatedly that they have doubts based on their intelligence information or other sources of information. For that to be assessed properly, that evidence needs to be submitted either to OPCW or to the Security Council. So the other extreme of the coin is that a challenge inspection is mounted, whereby basically OPCW in this case says we have there's reason to believe that we need to go to site A, B, and C because there's something else not declared. And this is now a theoretical description. It could be in country X. Let's say it could be in my country. So this has not happened. precisely because there's an ongoing dialogue, there is a conversation and continuous planning discussions with the authorities to make sure that if there is a perception of gaps or need for clarification, this happens now in a constructive, collaborative fashion. If, however, some member states are not satisfied at the end of that journey, there are still many other diplomatic political steps that can be taken. So it's sort of where that's not the point of departure. But the onus of proof is on those who raise the question.
And any chemicals in the hands of other people, not the government?
Sorry, yes, no, second question. We get recently the Office of the Secretary General, but I think also OPCW, we get fairly frequent alerts or also letters asking us to look into presumptions of possession of chemical weapons material. Probably not a chemical weapon, but ingredients to make a chemical weapon. It's very difficult because unless significantly more evidence is provided, and then there needs again to be a discussion under Security Council Resolution 2118. This can be addressed, but member states need to come forward. OPCW has a sort of shorter route, but then you have, of course, member states or non-state parties, let's say the alliance of a group of citizens in the region, they need to ask the member state to submit it on their behalf. And I know this sounds like a boring bureaucratic process, but it's a very carefully crafted political process because it also comes back to the responsibility to provide relatively credible proof, because it's a complex process you then launch. But it's very important, and I think it remains an important issue to monitor, and I know the UN does very carefully, as does OPCW.
I understand that chemical weapons have been removed, but the process is still continuing. So Syria does not have yet, the regime in Syria does not have a clean bill of health about this issue. Another thing is that Syria got these chemical weapons from some countries. And most, did those countries cooperate with Korea or Britain? Because this morning I read something that the Britain supplied something about this. I don't know how true it is. Third question is, okay, Syria had chemical weapons. We always doubted until it was used. But there are other countries in the region that have chemical weapons. Does the international community act when it is used, or always in this case?
Your first question, indeed, the chemical weapons elimination program is not yet assessed to be fully complete. I think a lot has been achieved, and we said a new chapter starts because there's still an ongoing conversation on Syria's declaration, which is in a way the heart of the matter, that is fully complete, or what needs to be done to make it complete. And secondly, there's ongoing work on the destruction of tunnels and hangars. And that will take us well into 2015. But that is a very practical engineering type of exercise. Once agreed, we hope that a decision will happen today in The Hague. If that's agreed, then it's about getting the supplies in to cement off tunnels and to destroy hangars that are part of a declared chemical weapons program. So it will take a little bit longer, but the bulk of the program, of Syria's declared chemical weapons program, is eliminated once and for all. If other countries have supplied, I think Syria was quite advanced in the design and construction of its own chemical weapons program. I think a lot of components, let's say isopropanol and other ingredients, you can buy freely on the open market. So I am not in a position to say country A, B, C, or D. At the time, I think it was either permitted. One would have to go back to the sources. But a lot of the ingredients for a chemical weapons program, material in particular, are actually products you need for many other purposes, purely civilian purposes. It's only when you combine them with certain other ingredients, it suddenly becomes very harmful. When it comes to the non-proliferation discussion of chemical weapons, or in this case also weapons of mass destruction in the region, I think that's ongoing, but member states have to push that agenda. It's not something that we address.
Any other questions, comments?
is unsure as fear. Syria has the technology now for chemical weapons. Do you think she will do it again? Let's say a war with Israel. She can have another time the chemical weapons. She has the technology, she has the minds. What would the OPCW do in this case?
Well, it's a fairly theoretical question, so I cannot not speculate. What I can say is that Syria's chemical weapons program, the way it was constructed and in place, is no more. It will take quite some time to resurrect this. What I also know is that I think a number of member states in OPCW will continue to monitor and follow the data and other information sources quite accurately.
Can I ask one more? Does your experience prompt any new discussion among the Security Council or other member states of the UN about exploring a regional weapons of mass destruction free zone in the whole Middle East?
It has not in our sessions. I know that in other fora of the UN, the Committee for Disarmament, these kind of topics are of course regularly debated. And the Syrians themselves frequently raise it, as do other countries of the region. But there are other fora for that to look at that.
Up there and then there.
Robert Wittkoen from I'm a graduate student at the Political Studies Department. There is something that makes me a bit pessimistic when we think about the lessons learned, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I get the feeling that when we think about the lessons learned and how to use your positive experience from that case, seems to me that the interest of the involved political parties and their commitment and the consensus was more based on their own individual interests and not so much based on the interest for protecting the Syrian population. So when I think about how to apply this to other humanitarian problems or conflicts, I do not really see how to use that experience. I don't know if you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I do. And my question to you was also, I mean, I'm not here to either sell success or a model whatsoever. It's an ongoing exercise, I think, in reflection by all of us. But I think you have to remember, however, that the degree of altruism and responsibility to protect by the state party or others is perhaps relative, but I think the convergence of political interest and a shared goal that can at times be higher than all other factors is ultimately important. We're living in a world of politics at the end of the day and considerations. The humanitarian imperative, the human rights imperative is very clear for, I think, for all of us. But when a conflict rages, a number of other factors come into play. So I think from a policy making perspective, you also have to look at the situation and see what can be the driver of change. What is the lever and where is the opportunity? And I think what has happened, and it can be an opportunity born out of necessity, but make use of the necessity, seize it, apply it, and come with a credible way of working that you can help overcome that. I could not say, for instance, today, if we have the same set of circumstances to achieve success as last year. I could not say that. So I think it's about timing and timeliness, but then about credibility, solutions, and a tremendous political alliance that drives that. That does not always have to come from an altruistic sense. But if you know you're doing it for the right reasons, that I think makes a big difference.
Thank you very much for the talk. You stressed upon the necessity to have member states push through an agenda, and we saw in Syria that was clearly the case, how the international community pushed through to have a mission to remove the chemical weapons from Syria because of the Ghouta massacre and because of the place of the Syrian conflict in media. But don't you think as well that, because chemical weapons have been used beforehand in the Middle East, why have we not seen such an outrage for the use of chemical weapons, for instance, in Iraq, against the Iranian army? as well allegations of use of chemical weapons in previous Gaza attacks. So you stressed upon political pressures and political circumstances, but we haven't seen mobilization by member states to help these causes in the past.
Yeah, I think it's a very fair observation. I think that's why we as UN officials or others, or if you're in an NGO or an advocacy group, I think that is the responsibility also of citizens to raise that alarm. If it's not always politically palatable or acceptable or it runs around against other interests, I would certainly hope that people like you and others will mobilize. Mobilization, no, we're living in a world nowadays, mobilization is no, and multilateral mobilization is no longer solely the purview, to my mind, of member states. Member states can be pushed, can be asked, can be held to task. The system can be held to task. The social media is a tremendous enabler and the biggest mobilization tool to put pressure, to have information out there that may otherwise not always make it. The time factor is always tremendously significant. But you've also got to have responsible engagement with social media, as we know. You've got to make sure what your ultimate aims are, but so it needs some coordination and orchestration. But I think in this day and age, there's a lot of scope to influence and call for earlier action. Then the decision-making processes and the considerations member states may have may be very different, but it's at least not the absence of voice, which I think individual citizens in countries, particularly in crisis or situations of crisis, that's what they rightfully ask and demand. And the UN Charter it speaks of we the people. I think we're all also there for that, also as UN civil servants.
I'd like to ask one more, if I may. You talked a lot, several times you talked about the political, the technical, and the humanitarian elements of this process. Would you say that the political is the most important always and trumps the others, or are there situations where the humanitarian situation or the technical complexities of the technical side could push the politics?
Yeah, I think it's been, on this mission, it's been a sort of a happy marriage of convenience probably, of the technical with the political. The technical enabled to manage the politics, and the politics was needed to impose sometimes technical solutions to get a technical mandate done. But it's always with a view, of course, that this is a peace and security item at the end of the day. This was not business as usual for OPCW. It certainly also wasn't business as usual for the UN, because we've never dealt with chemical, or we've never dealt with disarmament in this way in the field. The humanitarian track, I think from my perspective, also coming of course out of the humanitarian world, was always close to all our hearts, particularly I think the UN civil servants, knowing that a lot of attention, money and effort was vested in this, and very acutely and painfully aware of the fact that humanitarian access was not happening and that people are besieged and supplies do not reach those in need. And I think that is always very painful. But it also shows, and I think the Secretary General made that reference in one of his recent statements, when the political will is there, all these matters can be dealt with. Because humanitarian assistance also has operational, technical issues, etc., etc. But you need to have agreement that people come first.
Okay, I think we finished the questions, and I would ask you to join me in thanking Sigrid Kaag for being with us today.